Are you tired of stitching third-party vendors together just to deploy and run your application? Do you not feel frustrated that you're more managing these integrations and vendor lock-ins than just managing the infrastructure yourself? What if I told you you don't have to be an enterprise company to manage infrastructure so you can actually build the platform that you want to run your code? So this is where this video comes into. I wanted to introduce you guys to SST. What if I told you you can run all your infrastructure in one file? Not multiple files, not multiple projects, but one file. SST allows you to do this, and I think it's brilliant. You can define anywhere from a Next.js application, Lambda, your container, and different services, your queues, and you can even do it across multiple cloud environments, both with Cloudflare and AWS at the moment, which just allows you to use Cloudflare for the DDoS protection and AWS for a lot of its other core features that are really useful, like SES, which is for emailing, and Lambdas, and so on and so forth. You can even spin up your own databases, which just, it makes things so much simpler. And I just wanted to take this moment to dive into why I think SST should be on your roadmap and why you should think about using it in your own. To jump in, let's just look at together what SST is. Foremost, it's infrastructure as code, but it's made simple. And this is something I really like in projects. You can actually monitor what actually happens to your infrastructure. You can use versioning control. And let's just dive in what makes SST so great, with a few code examples on the screen. All right, so the current infrastructure problem. Infrastructure is sometimes very complex to set up. There's a lot of disconnected applications and infrastructure code. You probably handling across multiple different repos just to make certain things happen. And the other thing is you sometimes worry about cloud builds. You don't really know what you're doing. Maybe you're trying to use Terraform or Pulumi, and you're probably not using the right practices, and you serve yourself a really huge cloud build just from a mistake. And there's a steep learning curve for this. And then you also have to manage and make sure everything comes together as one. So why does SST help to solve a lot of this? Well, it's all built in TypeScript on top of Pulumi. So there's a single TypeScript file for the entire infrastructure. It helps with deployment. It helps to keep things very easy and maintainable. And it's just very elegant. And we're going to dive into why that is. All right, now we're going to look at infrastructure as code. So I said infrastructure code, but what is infrastructure as code? So infrastructure as code is defining your cloud environments as code itself. And you actually deploy all of this to your cloud environments. You're not actually doing anything through the UI. You actually don't want to use any of the UI features. You're managing your whole cloud infrastructure through code. The benefits is you can use versioning control, and you can do more things at faster speeds using code to allow you to have a better management of your whole cloud ecosystem without having to jump through different screens and trying to find all the different configurations. It's just a nicer setup. Slides. All right. So I've been talking about SST, but what is SST at a fundamental level? Well, there's a single file called sstconfig.ts, and in here you can pretty much build your applications using SST, mainly for AWS and Cloudflare at the moment, but they do support 150 plus providers as well. That's all done in the documentation. All right, we're just going to look at some simple examples of how to build some of the infrastructure components. So first off, we're going to just look at how easy it is to build a Next.js application using SST. So in this instance, we've got new sst.aws Next.js. So we can see it's a AWS component, and it's going to deploy a Next.js application. We can also see it has a domain. What's nice is if you've got Route 53 configured on AWS, SST will actually configure the DNS according to this domain for you and tie it to your Next.js application, all done for you under the hood. You don't have to manually configure that yourself. It just makes things so much easier. Next is we're just going to look at how do you make a Postgres database on AWS. Again, very simple, sst.aws Postgres my database. I can hopefully you're starting to see the pattern here. It's SST, the cloud infrastructure that it's on, and the resource configuration that you need for it. Again, we're going to make a different table here. We're going to make a DynamoDB. This could maybe be used for, say, if you've got a chat app and you want to store unique IDs and filter chat conversations using an ID, you can use a DynamoDB for that. And again, very simple, SST aws.table spins up a DynamoDB table, which you can use in your application. hopefully it's becoming a bit more apparent what SST is trying to do. It's trying to make infrastructure more as components that you can use in your application. And really, you don't have to worry too much about the underlying infrastructure. If you do enable custom configuration, you can do that. It is available for you to modify as you wish according to the documentation. So look into that. Again, it's all built through Pulumi. So if you don't really like SST for a certain component, you can just switch to Pulumi and build it from scratch there. But SST is trying to make every infrastructure component for you a building block. So it's just easier to deploy and manage. So next is a VPC, a very common component you might actually want in your cloud infrastructure in AWS, because you might want a VPC that, well, one, you've got a VPC with an N8N gateway that you can allow your applications to talk to the global net. And a VPC also keeps everything private so they can talk to each other. But one problem with a VPC is if you don't configure it correctly and you want one application to talk to another and they're not on the same VPC or linked in some way, it just becomes a lot harder to do. And sometimes that can be quite tiresome to get the right configurations in order. And what I like about SST, it just makes it super easy. So again, same kind of components here. We're just going, only difference here, we're making the VPC variable, and you can see we're saying it's the new SST AWS VPC, and then we're giving it a name, my VPC in this instance. And then we're making a cluster. So a cluster is just like where we're going to be pushing images, and then we're also showing that it's part of this new VPC that we just made. And from that, we're going to just spin up a container service here. And we're also going to have a load balancer and tell it where it should be listening. And so this cluster is now part of the VPC, which can communicate to other resources on the VPC, which is done for us. In this case, we also want to make sure we've got a server. So that's the container that we actually want to use with the cluster. And here we can specify the different configs to run our AWS service, in this case, a containerization service in the cluster. Next, we'll look at functions. Functions are just lambdas under the hood. So if you want to build a lambda function, instead of getting very complicated in different infrastructure as code, SST's made this very simple and easy to use. It's just sst.aws.function, the name of your function, and the configurations of your lambda function that you actually want to do. And that's, for the most part, are the main components I just wanted to give you a quick exposure to using SST. Next, I want to talk about resource linking to me, which is actually one of the most powerful features of SST. It's actually one of the reasons I really like it. So we are making all these different components, but we might actually not be allowing it to communicate with any other application in our AWS infrastructure. And this is where linking comes in. It just allows us to link different components together very easily. So we don't have to manually output references and manually update IAM permissions to allow these different resources just to communicate with each other. And it's managed all for us in SST, which just takes a load off our minds, and we don't really have to worry about it. So SST just makes it super easy. So on the right, we've got an example. We're using a bucket, which is an S3 bucket. So we can create it. We also create a cluster, and then we actually just gonna make a service according to the cluster, and you'll see we're actually linking the cluster to the bucket. What does that mean? Well, that means when this service runs and we're trying to store any file, we've actually got access to this new S3 bucket that we made, and it has full permission to write to that bucket, which is just awesome. So it just makes things so easy, and it doesn't take much. If you are trying to import a resource, so say you create a bucket earlier and you want to include it in your Next.js application, you don't have to remember the URL or the specific code. You can use import resource here from SST, and then you could import the bucket right there. So we can see you got the resource.mybucket.name, but you could also use my URL, so you can push and store images to your S3 bucket very easily. So it just makes things super easy to work with. Again, I said SST is a multi-cloud architecture. Again, I told you SST works on different cloud services. At the moment, it only works with AWS and Cloudflare. Why is this so powerful? Well, because you can use Cloudflare's workers and DNS, mainly for the DDoS protection, to serve a lot of your main website. But then for maybe heavier loads, you can use an AWS container or different lambdas to run your application. So you can make this hybrid cloud approach very easy and manageable in SST, and you don't need a huge enterprise team to manage this complexity. And the best part is you're not relying on vendors. You can do this yourself very quickly and easily and manage it. I've given you a lot of different quick examples. I haven't really given you code, but I just wanted to show you on screen. This is just a simple button server that you could run on SST. You would just initiate your project. You would create your button server port that it runs on. And then on the right, you would make the VPC, the bucket, the cluster, and the service. And then that will actually run your application. And then just make sure you have a Docker file in the location where the button server is, so I can pick it up according to the configuration that we've put there. All right, so I just want to quickly talk about SST development. So one thing to note, SST has this way that you can run some of the infrastructure completely locally, but it does use an event bus to connect to your AWS environment. The reason why they do that is you can store secrets on your AWS environments that you might want to use for local development. Why is this so useful? Well, one, you don't actually have to worry about .env files anymore, and that's just a huge security upgrade. So you can think of you running a team, and I'm actually running in my own team, that we deploy everything using secrets, and I don't have to give them any .env files. I just need to make sure they have the right permissions to the dev environment to access the secrets, and that can run in the SST environment that they spin up, and they can run everything locally. There are some drawbacks to that, but for the most part, it just makes some things super easy. So you can run a local environment, you can do local tests to see how things work. Also, if you've got a database on your dev environment, you can also use SST to quickly pass the information through, and you don't have to also set all those config details aside, put them in a .env. So hopefully it just makes a bit more sense in terms of the development flow. And you can do this, the general deploy to staging, do some testing, and then deploy to production. And SST uses SST dev for the local dev environment. And then if you want to deploy to any kind of main production, so nothing's running on your local, you use the SST deploy -- stage production. One thing to note about SST dev is every developer has their own personal development branch. So if they are doing changes to infrastructure, it won't affect another person if they're using their own SST dev, which is great. So it just allows its implementation a lot quicker, and you can collab and not worry about stepping on other people's toes. So I really like that feature. Again, if you're doing deployment, the only difference you need to do is SST deploy, stage. In this case, it's production, and you can push straight to production. So again, what does the SST handle for you? It handles the VPC, the security groups, the networking configurations, the ECS cluster, the Fargate setup, the load balancer, the routing configuration, the S3 bucket, the IAM permissions, services, resources. It handles a lot. And this is just great. So if you're a small team and you really want to have more of an enterprise feel to maybe interact with investors, SSTs are a great way to handle a lot of this for you. And it's not going to make things too complicated. It's going to be part of your code, but not the majority of your code. And I really like it. All right, so just to recap, why SST? Well, first off, it's infrastructure as code. I'm very biased on infrastructure code. I think everyone should be using infrastructure code so you can manage your versioning controls, what you're building, what you're not using, and things like that. SST is already built on Pulumi, and Pulumi has been in the industry for many years now. And everything is housed in a single config file, which makes things easier to manage. And it's accessible. You don't have to sacrifice power or flexibility. It's very easy to manage. And it does support over 150 providers. If this video doesn't convince you to use SST, I don't know what will, but you should definitely give it a shot. And one last thing before we go, I just wanted to take you through the SST docs. Before I leave you, there was one thing I just want to note. The current version of SST is different from version 2. And if you're using a lot of large language models to help you with the coding, just be very careful. Make sure you only acquire with the current documentation. And the reason being is version 2 was built using AWS CDK, which was using stacks. Sometimes you would run into configuration issues. The current version is a lot more stable. and to me, a lot better experience to use. So I highly recommend that you make sure you're only using the version 3, and you always supplying LM with the current documentation, and tell it never to assume anything, only use the context. That's my pro tip if you are getting started on this. But this is the SST site. It has all the information that you want. Highly recommend joining the Discord channel. People are very helpful there. And if you also need a bit of help, use the AI on the SST website. I find it very useful. And if you have any questions about SST, please shoot me a comment down below. I'll happily answer any questions you have. But I hope you found this video useful. I'll see you in the next one.